Please go ahead, Chair Rubin.
Okay, good morning and welcome to today's virtual conference hosted by the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission. This is the second conference in a two-part series on public safety budgets. Last week, we heard from Los Angeles County Chief Executive Office. We heard from the Sheriff's Department, Department of Mental Health, and the Probation Department on their budgeting process. The recording for part one is available on our website, coc.lacounty.gov, and on our Facebook page. Today, we are looking at the budget process and thoughts about the budget process from a different perspective. We have a panel of speakers lined up to share LA County's diverse community voices on public safety spending. You'll be hearing from Greg Helmold, from the Auditor-Controller's Office of Investigations, Jody David Armour, law professor from USC Law School, Harry Leon, Crescenta Valley Town Council president, and Ivette Alé from Dignity and Power Now. Our moderator is James P. Harris, one of 9 commissioners on the Civilian Oversight Commission and a retired sheriff's lieutenant. And now I turn the program over to Commissioner Harris for a very thoughtful, enlightening program. Commissioner Harris.
Thank you, Chair Rubin, for that nice introduction. And good morning, and thank you for joining us in today's discussion about public safety spending, as we listen to input from a few of our community partners, as well as questions from the public. As we heard in last week's Part 1 conference, there are a multitude of considerations that go into the Los Angeles County's final adopted budget of approximately $34.9 billion, and that's B with a B, each year. If you were not able to join the conference last week, I'd highly recommend you visit coc.lacounty.gov to listen to the information provided by the panelists, which included an outline of the flow of the Los Angeles County budget process, as well as in-depth conversations about how the departments prioritize their budget requests. Department leadership from LASD, Mental Health, and Probation shared how their respective departments set priorities and discussed some of their top budget priorities for fiscal year 2021 and 2022. The budget process is extensive. It takes approximately 6 to 8 months to complete before the final budgets are approved. It begins with the proposal, then review and recommendations from the CEO, a public hearing, supplemental department submissions, and final adoption by the Board of Supervisors of each department. Later this month, the board will complete their recommended budget reviews for each county department in May, and in May, the board will hold public hearings before making final changes to the budget in June. The opportunities each county department provides for community feedback are important because the budget priorities should reflect the community's needs and the county's operations. Ideally, public engagement opportunities should be accessible and frequent. Today, we'll hear perspectives from members of the community to expand our understanding of various communities' needs, what they think should be prioritized in the county's public safety budgets, and we're also hoping for some productive feedback on how public opportunities for the budget process can be more engaging and effective. At the end of our discussion today, our audience will have a broader understanding of our diverse counties' thoughts on public safety spending. With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Greg Helmold from the Auditor-Controller's Office of County Investigations. Mr. Helmold.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. I'm a chief investigator with the Office of County Investigations. We are a division within the Los Angeles County Department of Auditor-Controller. In accordance with the government code, every county in California has an Auditor-Controller, and our board appointed Arlene Barrera to the Auditor-Controller position in 2019. She's a CPA. She has extensive experience in auditing and various functions that are carried out by the Auditor-Controller's office. And the Auditor-Controller serves as the chief accounting officer for the county. And there's a lot of duties described in the government code that go along with that. The Auditor-Controller works closely with the Audit Committee, which consists of 5 members appointed by each of the a deputy from each of the 5 board offices. And these members serve in an advisory capacity at the pleasure of the board, and they generally meet the 3rd Wednesday of every month. They actually provide oversight of the Auditor-Controller, and today I'm going to talk about the oversight that the Auditor-Controller provides over the county operations, including sheriff and probation departments. The purpose of these functions in the audit committee is to ensure transparency and effectiveness of audit work, and the audit committee will make recommendations to the Auditor-Controller, and they also are responsible for ensuring that board policies are current and accurate. As you can see, the Auditor-Controller vision is described there. Our goal here is to, our vision is to inspire and elevate public trust in county government by safeguarding the county's financial integrity, advocating and implementing best practices, and ensuring compliance with mandates and fiduciary responsibilities. We do that by providing the county with expert advice and leadership in business and finance practices, and to promote integrity, accountability, compliance, and innovation. Let me see here. The Auditor-Controller, we also provide, we also create the county's fiscal manual, and that serves as the minimum framework for, and ultimately each department, it's a minimum framework for a county's, county departments related to fiscal and county procedures. However, each department can create their own guidelines and should create their own guidelines specific to their department. And each department is responsible for maintaining its own system of internal controls. You'll see here on the org chart the many functions that the Auditor-Controller carries out. On the left, you have the countywide payroll and our technology groups that have our online and financial accounting systems. On the right side, you'll see our accounting system and tax proportionate. But in the center, you'll see our assurance branch, which we call ACES. It involves audit, contract monitoring, and investigations where I work. And if you could turn to the next slide, please. So ACES serves as a resource to county departments, the board, and the public. We exist fundamentally to support good government and the efficient administration of government. And this benefits everyone concerned with the operation of government and our ability to build trust with communities that we collectively serve. I'll go through the 3 divisions real quick. The audit division conducts an annual risk assessment and coordinates with the audit committee to develop an audit plan. And with our limited resources, we conduct audits across a variety of county departments, including sheriff and probation. Our audit division also administers an internal certification control program on a biannual basis, which consists of a set of questions that are specifically designed to assist departments in evaluating their own operations, and also requires them to sign attesting that they have implemented or plan to implement corrective actions to eliminate any internal control weaknesses they identify. Our contract monitoring division does just like what it sounds. They also perform a annual risk assessment, and they coordinate with the audit committee and various departments to develop a work plan for monitoring contracts. And these are the contracts that are not typically covered by the department's existing contract monitoring efforts, and usually that falls in the social service delivery areas. All ACES divisions also provide a variety of support to the board at their request. For example, several years ago, the DOJ had concerns about the treatment of minors in the probation juvenile halls and camps. And so the DOJ, the county, and probation entered into an agreement whereby the Auditor-Controller and our contract monitoring division specifically worked closely with the Department of Justice and probation to monitor the progress of implementing those corrective actions. And ultimately, we avoided a consent decree as a result. And then the third division, the one that I work for, is the Office of County Investigations. We operate the county's fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, and it's a central repository for all tracked allegations of misconduct by county employees, representatives, and vendors. If you could turn to the next slide for me, I would appreciate it. Our investigation results have led to improved internal controls and business processes, safeguards, recovery of assets, debarment of vendors, and even criminal convictions. If the allegations, well, most of the allegations we receive through our hotline are administrative in nature, and we refer those back to the departments for investigation. But if it involves a high-level official within a department or it's criminal in nature, OCI will investigate. We have a team of law enforcement professionals, generally with backgrounds in forensic accounting and auditing. And our law enforcement authority is described in Penal Code 830.13, which includes the ability to serve search warrants, which we mostly do on banks and internet service providers for email and such. So we are the only office authorized to investigate criminal activity within county government, aside from the DA and the sheriff's office. And our mission is to promote confidence and public trust in county government and support the county's strategic goals and initiative by leading the efforts to prevent, detect, and deter waste, fraud, and abuse. And we accomplish this by operating and promoting awareness of the fraud hotline as a resource for employees, vendors, members of the public to anonymously report fraud, waste, and abuse within or against county government. And you'll see the web links and phone numbers where we have staff that can answer anybody's call if they want to make an anonymous complaint. And we do follow up on that. We have a no wrong door policy. So if it doesn't belong in our purview, we will refer the allegations to the appropriate jurisdiction. Like all county departments, the sheriff and probation have very many fine employees and occasionally some that might go awry. And so that's where OCI comes in to investigate, and we work closely with the departments to help resolve the issues and, whenever possible, prevent a reoccurrence by addressing any internal control weaknesses we can identify. And ultimately, the department would implement those corrective actions that we help identify. For example, we've had an instance where not too long ago where there was a clerk in the inmate reception center who stole deposits. We had another example where a probation employee misused their county vehicle for personal use. And so if you want to see some examples of the types of investigations that we have, you can go to that same website, fraud.lacounty.gov. We have a link to various reports. We issue a report every 6 months to the Board of Supervisors, summarizing all the allegations that we receive and the outcomes of the more significant investigations. And we also have a page on our website where we list the improvement opportunities that we have for the various departments, as well as newspaper articles and things like that related to some of the more notable criminal cases that we've investigated. I also want to point out that you can go to auditor.lacounty.gov and review the results of the audit division's report. And every year they complete a number of audits of the sheriff and probation, and they provide recommendations for improving the processes and internal controls. And you may recall Robert Smythe speaking last week about a report that the audit division issued related to budgetary controls as well. And I believe you can find that report on that website as well. So we conduct all of our audits and investigations consistent with applicable professional standards, such as those issued by the Institute of Internal Auditors and Government Auditing Standards. And so with that, I think I probably used up my full 5 minutes, hopefully not more. But that's kind of an overview of our role in overseeing the county's assets.
Well, thank you, Mr. Helmold. I know I learned a great deal, even though I was with the county for 35 years. There's a lot of things about the county I still don't know, and it was very interesting. You shed a lot of light on that. Our next speaker is Mr. Armour, Jody Armour, professor of law from the University of Southern California. If Mr. Armour, if you are ready to make your presentation.
And I'm also a member of an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. It was formerly known as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And I think that gives you a kind of real early clue as to what my comments will be about. You know, law enforcement organizations like LEAP have really been at the forefront for many years now in helping us think about how we can more effectively and efficiently deploy our scarce resources, including our scarce law enforcement resources, in a way that does more good and less harm, right? And so, for example, they opposed marijuana criminalization for 20 years now, saying that we recognize that having to crack down on people about a joint or joints on their possession generates a reservoir of resentment between community members and the police force that has been given these laws and told to go out and enforce them against members of the community. And we can look at a lot of these laws now, like the marijuana laws, and recognize them as causing a lot more harm than preventing harm, right? We're really come to fully recognize that now, right? The study after study. So all those years, we were cracking down on people in the name of broken windows policing, on joint violations, little marijuana violations. We were up to over 600,000 a year, right? In some of these states, including California, those kinds of arrests. It was just bad policy that was unnecessarily creating, you know, resentment between the community and law enforcement. So I think law enforcement getting involved in the policy decision-making process itself, and saying that we all want the same thing, safety. And what we're trying to figure out is how to achieve safety with fairness and justice, but how are we going to maximize that, you know, our efforts to achieve safety? And is it going to be at the front end? Or are we going to spend on crime prevention through pulling people out of criminogenic conditions, crumbling schools, lack of jobs, lack of housing, lack of health care? Or are we going to make jails the receptacles of our social failures and put police in the middle of everything as kind of shock troops, which is unfair to them and ineffective for us as a society? Let me give you one example of some spending that we've done that we thought would solve the problems of policing in some communities that have arisen but haven't. And that is, for example, implicit bias training, right? I made my academic scholarly name in the law school world through writing about unconscious bias before anyone else was writing about it really in the legal academy. I wrote about, you know, when they were writing about unconscious bias, they were writing about it from a Freudian perspective, which isn't going to convince anyone unless you already buy into the Freudian framework. So I got into social cognition research, information processing approaches to human cognition, and identified unconscious bias. This is in the early 90s. And I went around and when I discovered it, now we call it implicit bias. But when I discovered it and started talking about it, I went around to police departments, I went around to corrections officers, organizations, judges. I was all over the country saying, unconscious bias, folks, we can fight it. It's a public health problem, but we can fight it. We can do something about it. We can learn about it, and then engage in self-regulation to control it. Now, here I am 25 years later, and I have to say that it has been, sadly, a ineffective strategy to teach people about unconscious bias. Because what we've learned, what the studies have shown over and over is, yes, we do have unconscious bias, but there's very little we can do to regulate it. As sad as that, you know, our mental reflexes and our mental habits are not as subject to conscious control as we would have hoped. So there's just very little you can do. So if you have a community that is subject to, you know, discriminatory enforcement practices because of unconscious bias, if that's the case, and we all kind of agree on that, many of us agree on that, then really the only way to minimize the harm to that community from that unconscious bias is to minimize the contacts between members of that community and those people who may act unconsciously in a biased way towards them. For in this case, police officers. Minimize the contact between police officers and members of these stereotyped communities, and you'll minimize the impact of stereotypes themselves on those communities. You're not going to minimize it through implicit bias training. I'm just here to tell you, I hate to say that. I had my professional reputation in some ways staked on unconscious bias, implicit bias training. It's a bitter pill for me to swallow. Right, but I can't lie. I can't argue with the empirical results that I'm seeing coming out of these studies, study after study. You know, other interventions. Let's hire more Black police officers. 3 of the 6 officers in the Freddie Gray case were Black police officers. There's a study out of Michigan that says just putting more Black or brown police officers in blue uniforms does not solve a lot of the problems. That's what we're just seeing when we look at the data. So again, the answer is going to have to be coming up with new solutions that bring us together as, you know, law enforcement and community folks who want to increase safety, increase overall well-being in ways that reimagine, as people keep saying now, what safety is in itself. And I think I may have run out of my time at that point.
Well, thank you very much. You've definitely given us something to chew on here. That's some pretty thought-provoking things you've said, and I appreciate your being with us today. And I'm hopeful we'll continue and have some more discussion as we move on. So, thank you for your opening comments. With that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Leon, and from the Crescenta Valley Town Council. Mr. Leon, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, Mr. Harris, thank you very much for your wonderful introduction to the whole panel, and also to Jennifer and Tracy for putting up with us and trying to put this event together. And thanks for the Sheriff Department also for being a part of the Oversight Committee, for being a part of a very important panel. And also to the panelists, you guys said a couple of things that are very, very important, and I will echo the sentiment that you guys presented. Mr. Holmer, I mean, the 1-800 number is a great idea, and I think that's a breaking the ice and letting people to feel comfortable to connect with the Sheriff Department. And also, Mr. Armour, you hit the nail on a couple of issues that it's very important that we all have to, you know, take a look at and think about. I'm an immigrant to this country, and the country's been wonderful, and it gave me what I didn't have. I was born with no father, so I know what the situations are, and the difficulties that the people been seeing for the or the young people that are facing it these days. My term, your term of when we were young is totally different, and then today our young kids are having a lot of difficulties. Our young kids are having a lot of issues, mental issues, psychological issues, and all that we have to face it. I'm not only being a president of the council for the last 5 years, I've been a council member for 12 years, but also created a youth council in my town. And I can see the difference when the young kids get involved in civil duties. And you can see how it builds their confidence. I mean, I had a gal that she was very shy and she was very scared to interact with people. But when she started being part of the youth council, it totally changed it. After 4 years, when she graduated, and now she's becoming a priest. You know, you see the difference that us as adults get involved with the kids, it makes a difference. So these are issues that we have to, before, or I'm saying in our time, we always used to fight crime. But right now we have to prevent crime of happening. Things are changing. Funding the Sheriff Department or the police, it's a very important aspect in our life. But we have to see how we can allocate those funds. You know, community policing is very important. If you want, I have 35% Korean population, 18% Armenian population, and the rest is Caucasian. I have 22,000 population in my town, 5.25 square miles. We have the sheriff department, La Crescenta Sheriff Department 012, and I'm a sheriff volunteer on reserve, and I know what the sheriff department goes through. When I 4 years ago, before I being a president of the council for position aspects of it, I couldn't continue patrolling. But when I used to patrol, and if it wasn't La Cañada side or La Crescenta side, which La Cañada contracts to the sheriff department, we been taught that to interact with the community. Our sheriff department is doing a great job of being a part of the community, being in all the events, coming and making a presentations if it was about elderly frauds, or having a program, the Explorer program and all that. That's being interacted with the community. And not only that, Mr. Armour said, you know, bringing diversified police personnel, it would help or not help. But what we saw is when we had diversified officers, it did help us in a way that we got to know the culture and got to know how to interact with the community and with the community leaders. And a matter of fact, some of the cultures that we deal with is they have this stigma about the law enforcement, but we try to break that. We try to let that chain open, and by creating a small oversight, like a civilian oversight that brings the concern and present it to the sheriff department and to the community liaison. And that helped us, you know, by breaking those stigmas. And we should, like Mr. Armour said, we have to come up with the new ideas. We're all not perfect. We all are human beings. We make mistakes, but we have to overlook all these mistakes and try to clear the path for the future. You and I were already up in the age that, you know, we already lived our lives in a ways of our ups and downs, but we have to always concern about the youth. You know, you know, when in my time I was an orphan and I had elderly people, you know, guide me, and I used to look up to those elderly people, and they were mentors. That's what we have to create, a mentorship, if that's the correct of saying it, that we can go ahead and tackle those young kids, okay, or community members, that they can look up to us as a law enforcement or as the politicians or as the community leaders. And 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 the way we're doing it, like this panel, and it brings people's ideology, you know, in mix with different ideas, and then at the end we can start, you know, the sheriff department or the supervisor's office can go ahead and see what kind of ways that to approach this problems it's effective. And the way I see it in my town, and Supervisor Catherine Barger been very involved with our sheriff department, been very involved in our community, and that's what breaks the stigma, and that's what we want to let that stigma get diluted. And we got to come up with creative ideas and see. And I just have a small question to Mr. Holmer. Those 1-800 number that you had, does it have different languages, or it's only on in English?
That's a good question. We do have bilingual staff, and then we have a list of others that we could refer if we do receive a a call, but I'm not sure should we do the question and answer here?
Oh,
Can I
I'm sorry.
answer that?
Is this a question answer, or we can just go ahead and pass it, Mr.
Well,
Harris?
I mean, if you want to go ahead and just answer that question, that's fine. But
Yeah.
I would ask you then, Mr. Leon, if you can then just finish your comments and we'll
Okay.
ask.
All right. Okay. I'm
Yvette
sorry.
quicker.
Okay.
That's
then,
okay.
Mr.
No problem. Hey, we're going to we'll
Because
roll with this as it
that was
comes.
the part that is connected to the community issue. That's what
Yeah,
I was just wanting.
our operators do speak English and Spanish, and then we also accept email, so you can send emails in any language there as well. And our website, when you go to the website, I'm not sure how well the translation works on it, but it's a good question. It's something that we should take back and consider. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Harris, I apologize. I just jumped the wagon too quickly, but
That's all right.
all right. So my thing is to be very more oriented as a community connections, and also to see mental health and how the issues are tackled. And apparently everybody is on certain medication these days and all that, in one way and another, including myself. But it really affects the way of our life, and making the sheriff department or the county to know how to tackle those issues. And I think I'm over past my time limit, and I appreciate listening.
Thank you very much. We'll have lots of time for questions between both panelists and also taking questions from the public. So thank you very much. With that, it brings us to our next speaker, which is Ivette Alé from Dignity Empower Now. Yvette, please chime in.
Hi, thank you so much for creating this space for this conversation. It's a very urgent conversation given our budget cycle, and also given the mass amounts of needs that our communities face. So I'll start with sharing a little bit about myself. My name is Ivette Alé. I'm the Senior Policy Lead at Dignity Empower Now. I'm also a commissioner on 2 county commissions. I sit on the Gender Responsive Advisory Committee and also the Public Safety Realignment Team. I've been doing budget related advocacy work for nearly a decade now. I'm a budget wonk. I love numbers. I love budgets. So if you're excited about that, we're in good company. I'm also an immigrant. I lived most of my young life here in the United States as an undocumented person and as the child of an incarcerated person. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intercommunal violence. And so these intersecting experiences of being a survivor, but also having a loved one that's gone through the system and feeling the impacts of that incarceration on the incarceration of my loved one and how it reverberated through my family. We ended up houseless as a result of the incarceration of my parent. And so I have these intersecting experiences that are often pitted against each other. This narrative that in order to keep survivors safe, in order to keep marginalized communities safe, we need more incarceration and we need more policing. But what survivors of color know, what Black and brown survivors, trans and gender nonconforming survivors, undocumented survivors, folks on the margins that are most impacted by these systems of oppression, we understand that these same systems that utilize our narratives and our stories to justify policing and incarceration are actually the same systems that are criminalizing us and are also taking resources away from our communities that can actually help us address the root causes of problems. So I share all of this, these personal pieces to really humanize the conversation that we're about to have today, because we're talking about actual people's lives that are marginalized and are not resourced because of how we prioritize the budget. Our budget is an imagined future. Every dollar that the county allocates and decides that they're going to spend this year is not just about meeting the bottom line for this fiscal year. They are investments in how we want to see our future, right? And so that's why budgets are so important. And the context of this conversation is public safety. And again, it's important for us to understand that public safety should not be limited through an understanding of reactionary budgeting. last year, Supervisor Hahn very rightly pointed out that the budget that was presented before her was a status quo budget. And I agreed with her. And I would take that one step further. The budgets that are presented year after year here in LA County are not just status quo, they are reactionary. Because when we're not addressing and investing and tackling the root causes of harm, the root causes of criminalization and incarceration, we are just presented with reactionary responses. Most law enforcement agencies solve maybe 1% of violent acts in our communities, 1%. And so when we're thinking about what is actually going to secure public safety for us, right? It's actually getting to the root causes. And I appreciated Mr. Leon talking about addressing those root causes, right? We need to be really addressing what the needs of our communities are. And not just as a law enforcement PR campaign, right? Giving out bikes to our kids, right? But actually resourcing those kids. Because our communities, Black and Brown communities specifically, we don't have a lack of mentors. Our mentors are taken and extracted from our communities, right? And so when we prioritize keeping families together and actually resourcing young people, resourcing our marginalized communities, rather than just trying to create better relations with law enforcement, we're actually investing in the root causes. We stop presenting reactionary budgets and we're presenting proactive budgets that address those root causes. One illustration that I really find powerful around this idea of imagined futures and the budgets, it's in Ted Conover's book, New Jack. And it illustrates the idea of budgets as imagined futures made real and the ways that the alternative futures reflect different ideas about who we are. So in the book, Conover is talking to a person in prison he calls Larson, who is locked up in Sing Sing, one of New York's oldest and most deadly prisons, much like our own Men's Central Jail, right? There has been a news story that the governor of New York is going to spend money building new clean prisons, and Conover is surprised that Larson opposes that spending. And Larson explains, anyone planning a prison they're not going to build for 10 or 15 years is planning for a child. Planning prison for somebody who's a child right now. You see, they've already given up on that child. They already expect that child to fail. Now, why, if you could keep that from happening, if you could send that child to a good school and help his family stay together, if you could do that, why are you spending that money to put him in jail? This really illustrates this conversation around proactive public safety, community-led and community-informed public safety. Because every time someone goes to jail or prison, it's a policy failure. We often hear the contextualization of incarceration as a personal failure. And very rarely does government and leaders in the community really identify this as a failure of policy, a failure of leadership. We use the criminal justice system to cover up those failures, right? Reactionary. We have spent decades criminalizing public health issues, which Mr. Leon had mentioned. When we have such a massive mental health population in our jails, when LA County jails are the largest mental health provider in the country, we have a serious issue. We have a serious policy issue. And in being able to invest those dollars at the front end actually reaps the county a bigger return on investment on public safety. And so when we're thinking about financial and fiscal responsibility, and also the responsibility we have to those communities that are on the margins, it is imperative that the county start investing proactively and not reactionary. And law enforcement, you know, I appreciated Mr. Hellman's presentation, but one thing that he said really stuck out to me, which is that law enforcement, there can be some, you know, bad apples was the gist of it, right? There's some folks that that are not adhering to the values or to the expectations of the office, but the problem is not just a few bad apples. It's not just a few officers that break the rules or a few county officials that break the rules. These problems are systemic. We also need to be discussing the culture of law enforcement, the roots of law enforcement, which are rooted in, you know, slave trapping, which are rooted in the incarceration and extraction of indigenous people on this land. So it's really important for us to understand the roots of these systems and also the historic implication of how this informs the culture of law enforcement and incarceration. Our goal as a county should be to end the incarceration of all people. That should be our shining light, and reverse engineer how do we get there? How do we start investing in the things that will get us to the place of real public safety when folks have their needs met, when folks have housing, when folks have healthcare, and we don't have to incarcerate people in order to achieve public safety? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, a lot in there, and appreciate your passion. I can tell you really have given this an incredible amount of thought. I'm really happy to know that you're a fellow commissioner and you're using your gifts and graces to the betterment of the entire county, because I think that's where we all need to be going. At this point, I might just ask a few questions. Well, just one little, let me give a brief announcement that's for all WebEx users that would like to ask a question to a specific panelist or the entire panel. Please click on the hand symbol in the participant window, or send a chat to the host to get in on the queue. But with that, before we jump into public questions, I know Mr. Leone asked a question of Mr. Helmold, and I may just ask a question here myself and to see what panelist wants to jump in here. How do you feel, how do any of you feel that public safety budgets moving forwards or towards being more reflective of community values? How can we make public safety budgets? And with that, I'm not just limiting this to sheriff's budget, but public safety is a lot of things. I know I heard a former LA City councilman make the comment many years ago, and I happen to agree with this, that actually the libraries in some ways are public safety, and I understand where they were coming from. But the larger issue of how does public safety, how do these budgets move forward to reflect community values? So would anybody like to take that on?
I think one that all
Mr. Moore.
share. Thanks. I think that one value that all communities share, all communities that I'm familiar with, is they want crime solved, serious violence crime solved in their communities. They want murder solved. They want rape solved. We have rape back kits in some places, many places, that have, stacked up because we have sometimes rape clearance rates of 20% or less, under 50%. And homicide clearance rates in many places, right? And a lot of those, it's even worse than that when you consider that many of those homicides almost solve themselves because the victimizer is standing right there at the time of it. And so, you have a pretty good chance of not getting caught if you don't stay at the scene of a crime and kill someone, right? That's what our clearance rates are telling us, right? And so all communities want those kinds of crimes solved, and Black community is no different. The reason a lot of times, for example, those crimes aren't being solved, rape kit backlogs are piling up, is because those resources are going elsewhere. They're going towards turnstile jumpers, broken windows policing, right, that we were talking about earlier, and other kinds of allocations of those resources to kind of more misdemeanor offenses, going after houseless people, for example. And there's a recent study out of Boston, by the way, that shows that going after misdemeanors is actually counterproductive. The broken windows thesis, for so long, you have to go after the smaller crimes, crack down on them to prevent greater crimes. There's some interesting studies coming out of Boston University now that are giving a lie to that. So instead of having law enforcement resources directed at those kind of quality of life enforcement issues, having it going towards solving violent crimes and rapes and the like, which is resource intensive, would be would be welcomed by many in the community.
Thank you. Any other panelists like to weigh in on that?
If I may,
Mr. Leon, go ahead.
We as and when I'm saying we as a law enforcement community, okay, we should be more involved in the community as it is. As I can see the difference that is happening, and I see where Mr. Armour coming from, and if we identify the situations or identify the problems that we haven't, then we know how to tackle it. We're not going to be able to tackle every issue that it comes up or every issue that we face it, but at least we give it a try, and get it involved with the community. I would like to see if the budget permit that we can have a bright of different community engagement programs, create permanent community policing type of a program that makes involved with the roots and makes involved see where the problems are occurring. There's two kind of a problems that you face. One is internal problems that you have in the community, and there's an external problem that it comes up from different places to the community. So we should have to identify those issues and tackle them. I'm a commissioner of the Consumer Affairs and Business Affairs, and I see when our staff get involved in very diversified matter, and it makes it our life and job easier if we accommodate as much as we can, because then the people will be at ease and seeing like us being a part of them, because they like to somebody listen to them. If you take the issue and say, okay, we got a report, here's a report number, see you later, they feel deceived. So I would like to see a kind of program that the follow-up programs let the people know, as we do in a consumer affair aspects of it. But I would like to see if the law enforcement community can go ahead and adopt something like that, a follow-up, and make sure how the issue was handled and taken care of. And I think that's a part of Mr. Holmer maybe can elaborate on that. But I think getting involved in the community, it would make a difference.
I'd like to jump in here. I mean, in terms
Please
of
do.
public safety, in terms of public safety budgets, housing should really be at the top and seen as a public safety strategy. People that are houseless are 17 times more likely to be arrested than people in our county that are not houseless. And when we look at the disproportionate impact of houselessness on Black communities specifically, and how that translates to a disproportionate overrepresentation inside of our jails, Black folks making up 8%, 9% of our population here in LA County, and over 35% of the jail population. The disproportionality is even greater when you take a look at the subsection of folks incarcerated that are LGBTQ+. When you take a look at Black women specifically, who benefited the least from decarceration over the last year due to COVID, and their disproportionate representation is actually greater across gender and across race. It's really important that we're targeting our public safety funding to provide resources to these community members specifically. The other piece I want to address is the idea of community policing, because it keeps coming up. The idea of community public safety is something that I would support, but not community policing. Community policing implies that we have more law enforcement presence in the community, and that we even hire, more Black and brown representation or members of law enforcement that represent the community. We take a look at Alex Villanueva. He's a fellow Latino. He has had one of the most corrupt and murderous administrations. Representation is not enough, right? What's more important is resourcing those communities, and like Mr. Armour said in his beginning comments, reducing the interaction between law enforcement and the community. Law enforcement, they are not social workers. They shouldn't be expected to be. They are not mental health professionals. They shouldn't be expected to respond to mental health crises. And so when we think about public safety, it's resourcing the actual experts, the community members that are actually well-versed in their community and are doing that work of public safety outside of the law enforcement framework, they're trained in de-escalation, that are already providing youth services, that are doing gang intervention work outside of law enforcement and doing it effectively. We have Chuco's Justice Center in South LA that is doing amazing gang intervention work with former gang members and folks that have spent time in prison that have lived experience and have been targeted by incarceration, doing that work in their community. They know their community, they're respected by their community, and they're well versed in the needs of their community. That's the type of community-led public safety that we need, not shipping law enforcement into these communities and dropping them in and expecting our community members to respond. You know, our communities don't trust law enforcement because they're killing our young people in the streets. They don't trust law enforcement because they're extracting the dollars that should be going to housing, mental health care, and other needs. And so when we think about public safety, we really need to be grounded in community-based, community-led responses to public safety that actually center those that have lived experience, center those that have been most impacted, and let them lead. And so when we think about the construction of the budget in this budget cycle, we need to implement participatory budgeting. We need to give our community members the ability to weigh in and have an input on how the budget is constructed in an impactful way. Measure J is one of those examples because the county has refused to significantly reduce the spending on law enforcement, including probation and the district attorney's office, and has failed to invest in the things that actually keep our community safe. So Measure J is an example of a community-led effort in order to really reimagine how our budgets are worked. And I happen to co-chair the Economic Sustainability and Opportunity Subcommittee of Measure J. And the recommendations that came out of the community were incredibly transformative. And so it's really important that we resource those ideas, resource those needs that the community has already elevated through both the Measure J process and also through the Alternatives to Incarceration workgroup process.
Well, I could ask a follow-up question of you, Ms. Alé. So how are those desires being communicated to the Board of Supervisors so they know? I mean, we all know this budget process is a long and winding road, and there's an awful lot of hands that go into making the mix here. So yeah, how are those desires being communicated effectively to the Board of Supervisors so we can make those changes that you in fact are so passionate about?
Yeah, I appreciate your question. So they're being communicated to the Board of Supervisors in a variety of ways. So through the Measure J process, there was a community subcommittee process where the community could weigh in. There's an advisory board that the Board of Supervisors both appointed and selected to develop the final recommendations. Those recommendations will then go to the CEO's office, and then the CEO will incorporate it and present it to the board. So that's one mechanism. But what we really want to see is direct communication with the board offices, right? And so the Justice LA Coalition is one of those advocacy groups here in LA County that has been doing budget advocacy work with the supervisors for a while. Last year, Justice LA put out their Care First budget. So Justice LA, which is a coalition of over 50 organizations based here in Los Angeles, representing folks that are survivors and impacted by incarceration. We took a fine-tooth comb to the budget to identify those line items that can be easily transitioned out of the Sheriff's Department, out of probation, and to community-based services. So that was delivered to the board. We have advocacy groups from South Los Angeles. We have the Youth Justice Coalition, which has been doing budget advocacy work specific to the probation department, which gets about $400,000 a year to incarcerate one youth, for example. So we are seeing all of these bloated, inflated budgets, and the community has been uplifting these misallocations for a really long time. And then additionally, there are community members on commissions like this one, right? And that's when we have an opportunity to incorporate recommendations into the reports we deliver to the Board of Supervisors. So on the Gender Responsive Advisory Commission, we're going to be delivering a report shortly to the Board of Supervisors, providing them with recommendations on how to allocate the budget to support the release and the diversion of cis women and LGBTQ+ folks. And so those are different mechanisms that we use. And of course, we have the Board of Supervisor meetings every Tuesday, and community shows up and provides public comment there as well. So we utilize every mechanism possible to get these recommendations before the board. The board knows where a lot of us stand. And so it's really about empowering the board to make the right decisions, right? Empowering the CEO to really incorporate the demand of community for participatory budgeting and really take a look at how we do budgets in LA County to begin with. It's bizarre, having done budget advocacy at the state level, it's bizarre that we don't have budget hearings throughout a much longer period of time the community can weigh in, that the CEO develops the budget, presents it to the board, and then we have to respond to it rather than really reverse engineer that, really set the priorities, have the board set the priorities for the CEO and the CEO react to it.
Well, thank you. And you raised some really interesting issues, and particularly that last one you just raised, that maybe this is the time that does need to change. Maybe there is a point here where, there's a better way of doing this, so the public really does have more impact. I'm looking to all the panelists, and if you want to say something, please raise your hand, let me know. But I'm going to call on Mr. Armour, though, based upon what Ms. Alé just was talking about, and the things you've also spoken about as far as the limiting the contact between law enforcement and the community. How do you see that becoming a reality through the budget process?
Right. Yeah, there are, especially in the budgeting process, as you're putting your finger on how much leverage do you have over the policy decision making by the sheriff's office or the chief's office. That's where the policy is really coming out of, right? And more in the city, you could say, well, it's really kind of coming from the mayor's office too, because they appoint the chief. But at the county level, with the direct election of the sheriff, you can really point to that's the policy maker right there, right? There's no question about it. No layers of mediation or anything else. And so how to affect that decision maker's policy making, how they exercise their policy making discretion becomes kind of the critical question. And you can, for example, determine what laws they have to enforce, right? You determine whether you're going to pass certain kinds of ordinances and laws that are going to outlaw houselessness, for example, right? Which we do and have done, right? In 2006, you remember the failed experiment in LA of the Safe Cities Initiative, in which we put more police in Skid Row, made Skid Row the most policed urban area in America by far, when we added those 80 police officers to Skid Row and said we're going to crack down on the down and out as a way of solving homelessness. I have all the data, I have all the receipts for this, right? This is what we told ourselves, that therapeutic policing was going to solve homelessness, because the problem of homelessness, we told ourselves, is not a lack of homes, affordable housing, and a lack of jobs, and a lack of mental health care and other kinds of health care, right? But it's personal deficiencies by people who aren't exercising personal responsibility. So the police will cite them, cuff them, put them in a cage, and then they can get out of their trouble by going to a kind of 12-step program at a mega shelter, right? And going through that program and, and curing their inner defects and repairing their inner brokenness, right? Rather than addressing the macro level social factors that are really driving homelessness. And so you see what a horribly failed experiment that was. And yet we spent millions, nay, hundreds of millions of dollars in that failed approach to, therapeutic policing. So that's why I'm saying we need to have real good clarity about cause and effect, what really works, what really doesn't, and not be afraid of, really information-based, evidence-based policy making.
Thank you. I don't know if Mr. Helmold or Mr. Leon want to weigh in on any of this, or we can. I'm going to ask Jennifer, do we have any questions from the public that would like to ask members of the panel?
We have two individuals who are in queue to ask a question.
Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and start with the first one?
Okay. First, we will take Adriana Quinones. You are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question, Adriana.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Good morning. As I was listening to every panelist, I do have some issues, and I would like to ask questions, especially from the professor from USC. I grew up in the projects in Los Angeles. I did get to live police brutality, but I also got to see very good policing. The area that I live in is we have a good partnership with law enforcement. The problem that I have is that our county supervisors continue to make bad policy choices, and they do not reach out to the community. They expect us to drive to downtown LA so that they can hear our concerns. That is wrong. Professor, how do we make our community responsible for their actions instead of always creating the victim role? Also, we do know that we need police enforcement, police to be reformed. And that is a non-issue. It has to be done. We need to have uh, training, same training across the board in every agency so that everybody knows exactly what needs to be done. Mr. Leon, I want to commend you for bringing to the board the attention that community needs to be involved. We need to be proactive. We need to have mentors. There's a lot of children out there that do not have fathers, so therefore they do not have any positive role models. There's a lot of things to be issued. Blaming Mr. Villanueva for what is going on, it's completely wrong. Everybody is to blame for the bad policy choices. So, Professor from USC, please tell us, how do we get rid of this victim role? And how do we take accountability as a community, as individuals, to start making changes in our communities? Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely critical that every community exercise its own agency and and find its own liberation in hopefully some kind of partnership with other people who see the importance and need for that as well. And that's what I've seen in I can just talk about my community right now. I'm just going to zero in on my community. Know thy lane is one of the first, maxims of advocacy. So in the Black community, at least, I can say that there's been a lot of agency. Black Lives Matter movement, and the generational upheaval that we've seen like nothing before it, right? And that has been through the grassroots activism of Black Lives Matter activists, right? And they have taken to the streets starting back in 2013, 14. And people were telling them, like they're telling them now, don't say defund the police. Back then they were saying, don't say Black Lives Matter. Don't say that. That's divisive. All lives matter. That always knowing that it was always Black Lives Matter, comma, also Black Lives Matter, comma, TOO. The ellipsis was implicit, but people were tone policing them, saying don't say Black Lives Matter. Then they not, just the same way they're saying don't say defund the police. And now you come to that movement's culmination to this fall at the ballot box after the streets were roiling with activists and protesters, and you saw that they moved the voters. The voters brought in George Gascon, who was running on a decidedly progressive platform. He gave the voters a choice. Jackie Lacey and George Gascon gave voters a very clear choice, right, about what kind of policy we wanted to pursue in criminal justice matters. And the voters, thanks to a lot of that grassroots activism, brought in George Gascon and Measure J, which you may not want to call it defund the police, but it's saying we need alternatives to incarceration when it comes to addressing our social problems, right? So I think there's a lot of agency being taken by folks in my community and the Black community, and not just accepting victimhood role, but going out and actively trying to make change and move the needle.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go ahead and move on to the next question now from Monica Thomas. Monica, you are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, I actually have a question for Mr. Armour and Mr. Hellman. I'm listening and I respect, Mr. Armour, everything you're saying, but I grew up in the Black community, and there is an alternative to policing as far as incarceration, because in the Black community, there's still a lot of crime. There's still a lot of people who are afraid to speak up. There's still a lot of people in the community who are complaining, even to this day, because I know a lot of deputies also, that there's nothing being done within the community about the crime as the offenders are going through the criminal justice processes. So my question is, within the community, there is an alternative to being incarcerated while they go through the criminal justice process. They can still receive the mental health process, go through all of that, but there are still victims within the community. So my problem is, why is it that people are taking the stance that basically the police should be taken out of the role, period? That's what I'm having a problem with. Because the first people we call when we need assistance is the police. And if we don't want to lock up people, which I'm not necessarily an advocate for by no means, but I think that the failures start is with the educational system. And I'm going to be quite honest, because parenting is a major problem, because you have to set a foundation for a child no matter what, as when they come up from that child. But, and I listened to the young lady when she spoke about probation. Probation has alternatives to incarceration as well, which is the community detention program. That there is an alternative to detention where the minors and adults can still receive the mental health services they need. They can still go to school. That's always an alternative to incarceration, where they can still participate in their community activities, but they're also being supervised while they go through the criminal justice process. So again, I live in the communities. People within those communities are afraid still, just like the murder rates that you're talking about, to testify. So that's part of the reason why when you mention crimes, murder crimes aren't being solved, rape crimes are not being solved. Rape, on the other hand, is because of the victim, because I've been a victim, literally, of rape. And you still go through that. Who will believe me? That part of it. So I just think that there are alternatives to incarceration, but we cannot just dismiss, law enforcement as a whole. And that's what I'm feeling as a community member, that this is what, everything is going on. And I don't think that dismissing or totally defunding police because, someone took offense when I think it was Mr. Holland mentioning bad apples. I'm Black Lives Matter all the way, but I just have a problem with listening to as though law enforcement is on the bad side of everything. And I think there are alternatives to detention in county jails and the juvenile halls. But I still think no matter what, there's a need for both, because we do have victims, and not all of the people that, we're, I guess, saying should not be detained. Some of them should be detained, period. That's my view. And I'm trying to understand, why is there a push? Because there's more to the big picture other than statistics. Because I'm listening to what seems to be evidence-based. Well, what are you going to do in the middle while you're trying to get the evidence to prove your theory or what have you? What's going to happen in the meanwhile?
Oh yeah, I'll address that first, since I think you addressed it to me first. I lead to agree with you. You're not going to find anyone who agrees with you any more than me that we need to take victims seriously. Victims need to be vindicated. Any good progressive prosecutor worth his or her salt is talking about victims. They have victims units that they are developing. They're making sure that we take victims seriously. And I'm not an abolitionist in this sense, and I don't think that most of the folks I'm talking to are saying they're abolitionists. Not all, I'm not going to say all, but most are saying something like, we should snap our fingers and tomorrow, there are no police and no prison, tomorrow morning. No, nobody I know is saying that. Maybe there are some people out there. I'm not saying I haven't heard anybody saying it in the circles that I'm running in which we're having serious conversations about this. What is being said instead is, and before I get to what I think is really being said, let me get to one other point that you made, because you're right. To solve the crimes that involve victims of serious violence, serious bodily injury, rape, etc., right? Serious violence. To solve those crimes, the police have to be respected in the community. There has to be trust and confidence between community members and law enforcement. And we've seen, again, in study after study, when confidence in law enforcement goes down, homicides go up, violent crime goes up. Right. So the moral credibility and moral legitimacy of law enforcement in the eyes of the Black community and other communities is crucial to the safety of our own community. We all got that. We reckon that's why I'm fighting so hard to have police doing the limited kinds of things I think they should and can do well. Right. They're not street level social workers. A lot of people in the group I'm in, LEAK, like I said, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is current and former police chiefs, lieutenants, captains, all the way down to rank and file, who are saying, give us a different way to think about safety and promoting safety and maximizing safety that doesn't always involve a punitive hammer. You know, let us focus our resources on solving those violent crimes that we all want solved, and get police out of. Think about how many lives we wasted or altered unnecessarily over joints for how many generations, right? Over a joint now. You know, like a wine spritzer, you know, that you can go around the corner and sip that wine spritzer. That's how joints are looked at now, right? And lots of places, people making and contributing billions of dollars, at least hundreds of millions of dollars to our tax coffers, et cetera. When I first started teaching criminal law, it was a felony for a same-sex couple to exchange intimacy. You know, same-sex intimacy was a felony all the way up into 2003. We criminalized way too much. We need to get police out of that work and focus on the crime. So I agree with you. I don't think we're in any disagreement.
I ask you a quick question though. Okay, so let's take a person who steals another person's car, for instance, right? I know, like me, for instance, it wouldn't be so much of a problem because I have 2 sons with a car, right? But what about the person who only has that one car, right? And let's say someone steals that one car. That's not a violent offense. So what happens with that one person? And they have a history of doing this. They have no mental health issues though. What happens to that person?
Here's what I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see, first and foremost, the person whose car was taking yours, I'd like to see some kind of redress. I'd like to see us work with you to get you, you know, back whole again, right? Mm-hmm. This is what a good victims unit should be. We should have resources in our budget, in our, you know, that addresses victims' vindication, victims' injuries, redressing their concerns. And so you'd have some place to go. Right, because locking that kid up isn't going to bring your car back either.
Right.
Right. He probably doesn't have any insurance, so you're not, you know. So all those kind of interventions, I would look at now. As to that particular person, what is it? Is he hungry every day? I got to figure out his situation. You know, there may be lots of things we're going to have to talk to and about. Yes, I'm going to intervene to be sure. And I'm going to stop that activity to be sure. But there are lots of ways to intervene.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we will move on to the next question is from Jennifer Ho. Jennifer, you are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for hosting this forum to talk about this important issue and the need to reimagine the future for community-led public safety. My question is for all panelists. So say you were given a scorecard. How would you grade the action and budget of the county's performance on public safety? So from an A to an F, A meaning, you know, we're excelling community expectations, it's exceptional, to F, we're failing community expectations, it's unsatisfactory. And the second part of the question is, from your perspective, what are the top 1 to 2 top immediate strategies that can affect moving us one notch up? So let's say you give it a D, how can we move to a C? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can
Who wants
start.
to take that on first?
Yeah, I can start.
Go
And
ahead.
thank you for your question. I don't want to be harsh, but when our metric of public safety is, one of the metrics of public safety is actually, how many folks are recidivating, right? How many folks are being arrested and incarcerated? And even despite some early decarceration measures at the beginning of last year, LA County is still the largest jail system in the world. We really need to sit with that, right? We lead the world in incarceration in our jails. That, as a starting point, already indicates that we failed to implement the right policies and budgets to actually service our communities. So I would say that LA County still has an F. We've had an F for a very long time. We, lead the nation in houselessness. We have compounding crises, and we have the second largest budget in the whole country out of any county, only second only to New York. So we are a very wealthy county with a really massive infrastructure issue. And the fact that our budgets have really failed to shift those resources year after year, although the board, to their credit, they've been signaling wanting to invest in alternatives to incarceration. They've begun to dabble in investing in alternative to incarceration. The community has spoken. There's a reason why the community passed Measure J in a landslide. And Measure J seeks to invest upwards of $1 billion, 10% of our locally generated revenue, our net county costs, for alternatives to incarceration and community investment. So the community has already spoken in terms of what their measure of success is. And then we have the CEO that recently put out her memo saying that she's only going to invest $100 million in Measure J implementation. By contrast, we see the federal government putting out massive spending bills to address the urgent needs of COVID-19 to help stimulate our economy. And yet we're seeing all of this this impulse for austerity by the county, that we have to be measured, we can't invest too much in the things that we already know work, like the Office of Diversion and Reentry. The Office of Diversion and Reentry has an 85% success rate, and yet they're on a financial cliff. And so the county has failed to invest in the things that actually work, is pouring money into the departments that actually have failed to keep us safe. So I would give them enough, but with the caveat that this year's budget is a chance for them to really change the course of budgeting.
Thank you. And would any additional panelists like to chime in on that one?
I want to add a couple of things, and
Please go ahead, Mr. Leon.
some aspects of it I agree with Ms. Ayala, and I would go ahead and categorize it in a different ways. In infrastructure, I think we need an improvement to catch up of the things that haven't been done all this time. Community involvement, I would have given C, but they're doing their best to accommodate, and I think COVID-19 did not help. But allocating the resources to go ahead and finding the new policies that it would implicate or try to make our community better is very important. As been mentioned, it's a very important, this budget that plays a very good role. But we have to be very careful, what's going to come ahead. I mean, economy, it's not going to be that good. We might have some layoffs, but because of the layoff, we cannot neglect the community. So I think I would stay with C in all aspects, but I would like to see to be better involved and better allocate our budget and allocate it to the places that it needs to be done. And I appreciate the supervisor's office that being very, very, very involved in regards to mental health. And mental health is a very big issue these days. And I would like to see that to be involved. But I would stay with a great C.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll move on to the next community question. Will come from Romana Bahares. You are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question, Romana.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. I first want to clarify for one of the people that asked questions. Mental health is not a parenting issue. You're born with it. And I think that the money has to be allocated in different ways. First of all, the county jails. DMH doesn't work there. You know, the mental health is completely run by the sheriffs. There should be some type of connection to either housing, substance abuse, or mental health. So when they leave, they're already connected to services. You know, sheriff department can partner up with the county, you know, in order to have this, in order for them not to come back to the jail. 70 to 80% of the incarceration, whether we like it or not, suffer from mental illness and or substance abuse. Another thing is that the money can go towards training sheriffs with mental health, improving their Met team. I think right now they only take 70 or 20 something hours of mental health training the police officers. That can be increased and put more money into the Met section of the policing so that they can address. I mean, 3 weeks ago, and he's still a man who was suicidal, you know, was shot. And I understand that that man advanced towards them, but shooting him 20 times was overkill, especially when the Met team was already on the way. Another thing is we are completely forgetting the children. These children that are having problem now are the ones that are going to be facing the prison system or the jail system or incarceration in the next 10 years. Yet DMH has put most of their money into the adult system of care, have ignored the children. Juvenile halls, they have been completely closed down, but yet there's no system in place to take care of the kids, foster kids, mental health, you know, kids that have mental health problems. There's nothing out there. Instead of closing the juvenile hall, they should have worked on the programs first and then closed them. I think that's the same thing that's going on with the funding. I don't think we should take the money away. We should just take control of how it's going to be redirected to the areas where it needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Romana. Did you have a specific question for any of the panelists?
No, I
that you'd
just
like
I
to
just
ask
really
for?
wanted to make a comment
Okay.
on that because I know that it seems like most of it is put on the money and defunding, and nobody's
Sure.
really taking time to see what the real issue is. And I do agree with one of the panelists said that we're forgetting the children because
Awesome.
everything's been taken away from them, and we don't understand that the children are our future, whether it's a good one or a bad one. And so I'm just really encouraging them to really, really take a look at the children's system of care, whether it's juvenile justice or mental health, and that the sheriffs start collaborating with DMH and start putting a lot of emphasis and money on their mental health.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Romana. And I'll pause if any of the panelists would like to comment on that before we move to the next community question.
I'll just say one thing, you know, the demands to defund law enforcement are not just about moving money out of those systems. It's about getting the resources to build the system of care that we need and deserve, that our communities can really benefit of. So that demand is not just about tearing things down. It's really about building things up, right? Because you know, year after year, the budget for mental health, like the last speaker was talking about, the budget for youth education, youth development has been a fraction of the money that the Sheriff's Department and probation gets. The Sheriff's Department gets 1 out of every 5 of our locally generated dollars, 1 out of every 5. And that's just the Sheriff's Department. That's not including the massive probation budget and the district attorney budget and the budgets to run the jail. So when we really think about what the demand here is for really transforming our budget, it's let's identify, like the last speaker was referring to, the things that our communities need and invest in those things. Let's start there. Let's start getting to the root causes of harm in our communities, and not just incarceration, because we know harm happens every day and folks don't feel safe calling the police, or the police doesn't respond, or the police can't solve the harm. But harm is real. And I think, you know, a previous caller brought up that there's real harm happening in our communities. And I would agree. As I don't call myself a victim, I call myself a survivor. But as a survivor of sexual assault, of domestic violence, I know that harm. But as an undocumented person, my family didn't feel comfortable calling the police to respond to our crisis of domestic violence, because that could have meant the deportation of my family. That led to the incarceration of my parent. And so we knew that calling the police was not the safe response for us. And we didn't have access to other housing because we were undocumented. We didn't have access to other resources in the community. So we were left alone with nothing, with no resources. And so looking at what the community members need, particularly those that are most marginalized, our trans community, our Black trans community, Black trans women specifically, who are just disproportionately impacted by violence, both state and interpersonal violence, addressing what their needs are. And I really appreciated Professor Armour really talking about providing those resources, providing that support for survivors and centering survivors in the conversation. I was part of DA Gascon's transition team and helped develop the victim recommendations for his department. I know that centering survivors is critical, but just incarcerating someone that provides harm doesn't actually break the cycle of violence, right? It's getting to the root causes, whether it's mental health treatment, substance use treatment, housing, education. Addressing that will help break those cycles of incarceration and will keep families together. That's another critical piece, is maintaining families together, addressing family separation, which happens through criminalization and incarceration. When we're able to, if my family would have been able to get my dad some mental health treatment and substance use treatment, he wouldn't have had to be incarcerated. He would have broken cycles of violence, and we wouldn't have ended up houseless. And my story is all too common. This happens over and over again daily in our communities. And so family unification, preventing family separation. So young people do have mentors, their parents, their loved ones, their family members, right? They don't have to rely on other people coming into their communities to provide that mentorship because they already have it. So what I want to leave folks with is, let's envision the type of communities we want to see that are safe and healthy. Let's work backwards. What do we need to resource to get there so that we don't have to rely on incarceration and law enforcement to provide safety? Because, we have to be real about the harm that punitive responses also give to law enforcement. It is not easy to be in an institution of violence. In fact, prison guards have I believe it's like a 58-year life expectancy rate. Like, these places are toxic. They're full of infection and trauma. And so folks that work in law enforcement deserve to work in a job that is actually good for their health and good for their community. And so it's time for us to really imagine what public safety looks like and think about both the people that are in the communities and also the people that are forced to work under those conditions.
Thank you. Thank you. And we do have 2 more community questions, and we will try to get them in very quickly. I do acknowledge that we're about 3 minutes out from 10:30, which is when we're supposed to finish, but we'll take a quick question from Andres Kwan. Andres, you're unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, hi. I just want to ask about how we really take a holistic approach and talking about the harm. There has been so much harm, and I just really want to lift up the systematic harm at the hands of the Sheriff's Department. A lot of us think that we've had something way more sinister than the Rampart scandal, the LAPD Rampart scandal ever was. Time's over for decades, and I'm talking about the crisis of tattooed racist deputy gangs permeating the ranks and management of the Sheriff's Department. Many of these confirmed by federal courts to be white supremacist, neo-Nazi. So my question is regarding to that, how do we reform that, right? Reform a department so rotten to its core that it's allowed deputy gangs to exist in the ranks and management for 50 years. So we know what happened with Rampart. Feds got involved at the Sheriff's Department level. Feds intervened before the COC was created, especially with the abuse of power and rampant deputy violence in the jails. And then the LAC's cover-up of all this, which, among other things, led to former Sheriff Lee Baca and Under Sheriff Paul Tanaka going to federal prison, where they are right now. And so in that context, to say Villanueva is worse than them is saying something, hence the COC's unanimous vote to urge his resignation. But that intervention, while it brought some reforms in the jails, it did nothing when it comes to the broader crisis of deputy gangs. And so they've killed and brutalized and framed Black and brown Angelinos for decades, including Frankie Carrillo. That's just one example. He spent 20 years in prison after a Linwood biking. Deputy gang member framed him for murder. And so
thank you. And Andres, I don't want to interrupt, but we are short on time. So if you could just go ahead and wrap up with your final question for the panelists, please.
And this is where I'm going to. The county paid Frankie $10 million, and it's being reported that the county's paid out at least $100 million over a couple of decades on losses related to deputy gangs. So how do we take a holistic approach to the Sheriff's Department budget and the entire county budget, of course? Because right now the Sheriff's Department and deputy gangs are not only killing and brutalizing with impunity, but also wasting our precious taxpayer dollars. And our money should be well spent and invested, not wasted.
Thank you. Okay, and would any of the panelists like to touch on those questions?
I'll just say real quickly that the kind of incidents he's referring to that many of us are familiar with, who've been keeping up with the news at all, those are things that aren't going to be addressed by any kind of implicit bias training, right? We recognize that those are problems that go beyond a few bad apples. And just that sober realization, I hope, is what comes to us and helps drive our policy thinking.
Thank you for that, Mr. Armour. And we will take our very last community question. It is 10:30 right now, so I do acknowledge that. If any of the panelists need to drop off, please feel free to do so. But like I said, we will wrap up with our final community question from Joseph Maslich. Joseph, you are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I'm moved by all the remarks, and particularly Ms. Alé's last remarks that, hey, a changed system is healthier and better for everybody, including law enforcement people. And that brings me to a question about the workforce. With the shift in jobs and what's being done, I'd like to hear whatever opinions the panelists have about what happens to the people currently doing the work that we know needs to be changed or reduced or replaced by other kinds of work. Do you just say, goodbye, thanks, you're no longer employed by the county? Do we say, here's a training program, or here are a few roles that you might have to be able to continue your employment, but it's going to take some work and it's going to take some change? Just what message do you have for the people currently involved in the activities that are going to be shifted in a major way, maybe from one department to another, or that may be ending?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I really appreciate your question because I've actually been thinking about this a lot, and a lot of our communities have been planning for this for a while. And so what I would like to lift up is a just transition model. So the just transition model has been used in the energy sector for a while, and unions have utilized this strategy. So for example, when economies are shifting from coal to more sustainable forms of energy, they've used this model to really move the workforce out of these types of jobs that are harmful to themselves and to our environment and into cleaner energy jobs. And so we can really look to that blueprint to transition folks out of law enforcement and incarceration and into jobs that are unionized, right? We support union, well-paying jobs for our communities. Everybody deserves employment or the opportunity for employment, right? And so a just transition model for LA County can look like several things. So incentivizing retirement. The city of Los Angeles did just that during the COVID pandemic to avoid furloughs. So instead of moving on furloughs, they incentivize folks that are at retirement age or close to retirement age to retire through some severance packages. And so that's one strategy the county can employ for folks that are close to retirement. The other piece is looking at what union jobs or county jobs can be a lateral transition for law enforcement. And so one of the pieces that it could be a lateral transition is emergency management. Every year, we're seeing more and more fires. We're seeing, more and more instances of environmental crisis. COVID was just that, right? And so having emergency management staff, really building that out for our county, will help us be proactive about future crises like COVID, like earthquakes, like fires. And a lot of this emergency management work is done in rooms behind closed doors, not interacting with the community. It's about really utilizing those skills that law enforcement gets, that type of military training to be able to disperse bodies and disperse resources in the community. That's something that could be a lateral transition for law enforcement that supports public safety. So they're still working in public safety, that doesn't have to interact with the community and utilizes the skills that they already have. And then I would also say that the county should really be working with labor partners to identify what are the jobs within the labor unions that can support that transition. What are the jobs that are actually the community has a high need from? So for example, for probation, there are a lot of folks that have social work degrees or have studied social work, or because of their level of social work went into probation. And so that's another way of identifying like what are folks' real desires, right? And really supporting that transition.
Thank you for that. And JP, I'm not sure if you could try speaking. We'll see if we can hear you.
Yeah, I am here. Do you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I've been able to listen to all the questions and comments that have come in over the past 20 or 30 minutes. So all some very excellent questions. And thank you, Jennifer, for picking up the baton and moving it forward. But yeah, we have reached the end of our time. I really want to thank all the panelists. I think this was a very good discussion. A lot of good information was exchanged. A lot of ideas maybe some folks haven't even thought about before, but have now been exposed to. So I really appreciate the time and the effort you've all put into joining us here today. Also, just a note, there's a post-event survey will populate when you close your WebEx, and we ask you to please provide feedback so we can continue to improve our community engagement efforts. But again, on behalf of the entire commission, Commission Chair Rubin and myself, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and that will bring an end to this workshop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.